During this presentation, we'll discuss the following topics. What is Active Directory and what is authentication? How does authentication work? Active Directory authentication versus authorization. Active Directory authentication means and methods. Things to consider when choosing an alternative Active Directory authentication system. What are the alternative Active Directory authentication methods available today? We'll look at the pros and cons of alternative Active Directory authentication systems. We'll look at the most widely used alternate Active Directory authentication system being used today, some recommendations for implementing an alternative Active Directory authentication system, and companies that offer alternative Active Directory authentication solution systems. So what is Active Directory and what is authentication? Active Directory is a directory service that's included with most Microsoft Windows Server operating systems, and it serves as a central location for network security, network administration command, and management control of resources for administrators and management personnel. Through the security function, Active Directory is responsible for authenticating and authorizing all users and computers that will be accessing protected and secured resources within or on the domain or network. Authentication is the process of verifying that the user actually is who they say they are or claim to be, and Active Directory is responsible for this task. Active Directory uses the Kerberos authentication protocol to authenticate its users. With a domain controller running the Key Distribution Center, or KDC, and allowing computers to exchange tickets over the network instead of passwords. KDC also uses long-term keys that are used between the security principals and the KDC itself. So how does authentication work? Well, when a user or system attempts to gain access to a network, they're required to input some form of credentials that contain some combination of a username and password. Once a user has input their credentials, the system then compares the credentials that the user input with a master list in the database containing acceptable username and password combinations. If the username and password that was entered is an acceptable match, then the user or system is granted initial access to the network. However, the user is momentarily limited in what resources they can access until the authorization check has been performed. This authorization check will then validate which network resources that specific security principal can access by checking the access control list, which will verify permissions that have been granted or assigned to that specific security principal. Active Directory authentication versus authorization. As mentioned, Active Directory authentication is the process of actually determining whether or not someone or something is who or what they are claiming to be. Authentication usually involves some combination of a username and a password that needs to be verified before being granted access to a computer, a network, domain, workstation, etc. Active Directory authorization, on the other hand, is the process of determining which permissions a user or system has been granted and what resources they are permitted to access based on those permissions. Once a user or system has been authenticated and granted initial access to the system, the computer will then evaluate the level of access the security principal should be granted based on the access control list, or the ACL, and the access control entry, or ACE, that is associated with that particular resource and/or security principal. Active Directory authentication means and methods. Means of authentication are usually grouped into three categories. 1. Something a user knows, typically a username and password. 2. Something a user has, This is often a key card, a smart card, USB token, etc. And 3, something a user is. This is some form of physical characteristic that's used as a biometric. Methods of authentication. Kerberos, which is a centralized authentication system. And this is a ticket-based system that uses cryptographic keys or long-term keys and tickets. CHAP is a challenge handshake authentication protocol, which is a three-way handshake authentication system that is used with dial-up connections for authentication purposes. Multi-factor authentication is the act of authenticating a user based on a combination of more than one authentication method. And there are several other alternative authentication methods that can be used instead of the above or in combination with the above to be used with Active Directory. There are several things to consider before you decide to choose an alternative Active Directory authentication system, like what operating systems will be used with the alternative solution: Windows, Linux, Mac, etc. What is the cost of implementing an alternative solution into your current network or system? What's the initial cost of the devices, the licensing fees, training costs, software, etc.? What will be the cost of replacing different components of the new alternative solution? What's the cost of replacement devices, batteries, authentication codes, damage, theft, etc.? Is there a variety of options and methods available to implement a multi-factor authentication system across your current system platform? And finally, what type of support will your company need with the new system once it's implemented? Will the system require coordination with the product agents, clients, continued training and support? All these things need to be considered when deciding. Let's look at some alternative Active Directory authentication methods being used today. Biometrics, which is based on data that does not change over a person's lifetime. Through biometrics, they use something that a person is as part of the login authentication procedure for a user to access a workstation or a server. Examples of biometric solutions are facial recognition, hand geometry, fingerprint ID, iris and retina scan, signature, and voice and speech. You also have smart cards, which are fully compatible and supported with Microsoft Windows Server 2008. These are used as an authentication medium in place of or in combination with passwords. They use the RSA key and require a smart card reader. RSA is a public key encryption algorithm that is used in authentication systems. And you also have portable USB devices, which are readerless smart card devices that actually store the authentication information on the device itself. So what are the pros and cons of the different alternative Active Directory systems? Biometrics. With facial recognition, while it can be matched quickly and facial features do not change over a lifetime, there is only a 90% success rate of match, so there is a 10% failure rate. Plus, images can be tricked, and they favor men to women. With hand geometry, yes, they are simple and easy to use, and they are very unobtrusive to the user. However, they are not unique to individuals, and jewelry can pose challenges to the software. With fingerprint ID, yes, they are cheap to install. Attackers can't guess a fingerprint, and a user cannot lose or forget a finger. However, these can be duplicated easily, and if someone gets your fingerprint file, it's a permanent solution that they have. With iris and retina scan, yes, these are highly accurate, and they are totally unique for each individual user. However, they're very intrusive to the end user and very expensive to set up and maintain. And with voice and speech, yes, these are extremely easy for the user to use, and the hardware is cheap. However, background noise does pose a problem, and these are easily recordable, so they're easy to fake. With smart cards, yes, these are very convenient to the end user. They are self-contained security devices. They're extremely inexpensive and very portable. However, they are easily lost and stolen. They have limited encryption options based on the chip size in the card, and you need special equipment to read the smart cards, such as smart card readers. With USB devices, yes, they are more secure than traditional username and password combinations. They can hold encryption keys and certificates on the devices themselves, and they are inexpensive and portable as well. But the user must always carry and possess the USB device. These are also easily lost or stolen. You do need multiple keys and multiple certificates for multiple tasks or functions that the device will take care of. However, keep in mind that because of how easy it can be deployed and the non-obtrusive manner in which it can collect data, facial recognition is currently being used today by military, police, and homeland security locally within the U.S. and around the world to track criminals and threats amongst the normal everyday crowd of people. So, what is the most widely used alternative Active Directory authentication system today? Well, while data is much too valuable to not keep secure, and tough passwords simply too much trouble for end users to remember, most companies take a hard look at what's being offered. As a result, and based on the pros and cons of all the available authentication systems available, most companies today choose a two-factor authentication system or a multi-factor authentication system that uses a combination of a password plus a PIN and then a USB device that has a new random code every minute for log-on purposes. The password is generated based on the recommended Microsoft password policy criteria, and the PIN number is normally a random number that is unique and memorized by the user, typically 4 to 6 digits in length. The USB device is then carried by the user and inserted into the workstation as part of the authentication process. And companies are secure in knowing that if the USB device is lost or stolen, it cannot be used to access the system without the personal PIN that only the user knows. Now, based on the research that I've done and looking at all the pros and cons of the alternative authentication methods, I would highly recommend a solution to a system that is going to be based on what you need from the new system and how it's going to be used to best achieve your security goals with it. However, it would be best to implement a system that's easy to integrate with your current system, is easy for the users to implement and use in their daily routine, is cost effective to install, maintain, and train personnel to use, works across a wide multitude of operating systems, works with mobile devices and mobile applications, allows two-factor and multi-factor application configuration security options, uses a minimal amount of resources, and is secure in itself and secure in the data that it collects. Based on the data, I would recommend Gold Key Security and implement a two-factor or multi-factor authentication system using the USB with a random PIN and a unique password. This seems to offer the most option for the largest amount of people and cost the least amount of money. Industry-leading companies today that offer alternative solutions for Active Directory authentication, specializing in smart cards and USB devices, are Gold Key Technology, Cypress Security, Crypto Card Securities, and CyberSafe Security featuring Trust Broker software. The following references were used in making this presentation through data and research. The rest of the references that were used as part of the research for this project and presentation. Thank you.